Today's Authors is brought to you by Kali Asset Management. Long-term success and solutions for each individual client. We deliver service and results.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Today's Authors. I'm Kaylin Brown from the College of St. Rose, and I'm here with our guest, Ed Dague, who has been an anchor on television broadcasts here for 34 years in our market, and most recently has released his new book, 6 and 11, A Television News Anchor's Story. And we are so excited Ed could be with us today. It's nice to have you back on TV, Ed.
It's nice to be here.
And I have a special interest in Ed's book because my students, my graduate students at the College of St. Rose just recently completed this book for our college reading assignment, and Ed was kind enough to come visit us at school, and we were so happy to get through the book, and then Ed came and visited us, and the students had all sorts of questions for Ed, including you've spent so much of your lifetime in broadcast, and now you're not in broadcast anymore, but what possessed you to sit down and put this down on paper and turn it into a book where you told a story?
They did. In a way, the publisher called me and said, journalism professors love to assign outside reading by reporters who are experienced. Can you write me a book kind of outlining what television was like in the early days, the formative days of the first days, really, of television news? When I was there at the time, I didn't realize that that's what was going on. But it was, and so they, in a sense, were the target. I just thought it was a terrific idea. So the book was written with journalism students in mind, which is maybe why there's a little more detail about production than the average reader would want, especially in the first chapter.
Yeah, there's a lot of talking about production in this book, yeah. And for anyone who's not familiar with how a television studio works, you get an eye-opening experience about what's involved in producing TV, and especially from back before they had the sort of technology that there is today. You've seen a world full of experiences in a newsroom and how the technology shifted.
It was probably the most amazing thing of all of the 34 years in the business was the changing technology, because I started shooting black and white negative film because electronically it's easier to reverse it than it is to develop positive pictures. But let me tell you, trying to edit negative film, I mean, everybody looks at negatives, and when it was color, it was really insane. But on a little screen like this, sometimes I had no clue what the cameraman was exactly editing. But then came color film, and then came tape, and then came live, and the business so changed. I mention in the book that sometimes reporters had to leave because they couldn't adjust to some of the changing technology, and I think the biggest one was the emphasis on live. When I first started, every reporter would write out the stand-up and then memorize it, and it became within about 10 years, there was just no time to do that. You had to be able to go on live and be coherent and articulate, and there were some people who simply could not do that.
Well, that was one of the biggest strengths you had in our market. I mean, I was a religious Ed Dague watcher my entire life, and I spent 18 years in newsrooms, so I only watched Ed Dague because I depended on you to give me what I needed to know from my television news. And I know other newsrooms did the same thing. But how do you go from being in front of that camera to sitting down with all those experiences and making a book out of it?
I don't know, and I was really anxious about that because I never took a college writing course in my life. You know, I studied engineering, although I can't do any calculus anymore either. I didn't think I could, and I told my editor repeatedly, Dan Lynch, I need an awful lot of help with this. The first chapter I wrote was on my experiences with Erastus Corning, and he only offered one thing. I sent him the chapter, and he really liked it, but he said, you've identified a Channel 10 reporter as a gadfly reporter, and it clearly was Herb Starr. Why don't you name him? And that was my first encounter with the question then of who gets named and who doesn't. I didn't name Herb because it's not a very favorable reference, in fact, and I was reluctant to do that, but Dan helped me with that, and I know you worked with Dan Lynch as well.
I did.
So I started naming names.
Just the facts, right? That's the part of reporting. Get out the facts.
Exactly. And I didn't want to hurt anyone. When the book came out, I was interviewed by Paul Grondel of the Times Union, who in a sense was disappointed that there wasn't more dirt in it, I felt. He said to me, and it was not, I guess, in the paper or entirely on the record, but he said, gee, you must have known of affairs and people meeting women or men at the back doors, and none of that's in the book. And I said, of course. It's a factual book about journalism. It's not dirt about area TV people, and that's not in there.
That's an interesting question that Paul would have raised to you, because in early journalism, we did not report on the dirt about, for instance, our politicians.
Right.
If you think back to the days of Roosevelt or Kennedy, for instance. But you also saw that evolve. So when you were delivering the news from the early days until the most recent time when you were delivering the nightly news, how did you sense a change in a way?
Yes. And some of it was really unpleasant. I understood when Keith Olbermann quit the first time, and he quit because he got sick of reporting on the Monica Lewinsky. When my good friend and colleague Chris Kapistashi, now Chris Jensen, went to MSNBC, she encountered that as well. It was really at the time of the whole Clinton impeachment, and she told me at the time that there was kind of a comment going around MSNBC that it stood for mostly sex, nobody but Clinton.
Oh, no.
That bothered a lot of reporters. I was really bothered the night I reported on air, and I guess it had to be, because it was relevant, a comment by Monica Lewinsky that time to get my presidential knee pads, indicating that she had some intent when she went there. And it was probably important comment, but I was really uncomfortable reporting that sort of thing. But what are you going to do? You know, and much of my last chapter talks about the difficulty of having to give people what they want, because in this capitalist society, journalism has to make money, and that means you have to attract an audience. I also mentioned in the book, though, that I used to tell the staff, if we put together the best television newscast in the history of television and no one watches, we have achieved nothing. So there's this constant battle. You have to attract an audience, but to what extent do you go to attract them?
And I know you always, that was a fine line, because, and you talked about it in front of my class as well, that you wanted to make sure people still received some of the information they needed, and you made sure to deliver that.
Right.
How did you deliver that?
With the help of the fellow who's now news director at Channel 13 and who I helped hire as a producer at the time, Eric Hoppel is his name. Eric and I knew what the research said. Consistently, people have no interest in international news especially, but they have to have some exposure. So we would kind of bury it in the second block. We'd pull them in the door and maybe tease something into the second block that was maybe even had some prurient interest, I don't know. But somewhere in that block we'd slip in some international and national news, knowing they probably weren't looking to hear it, but feeling that they should. And Eric was terrific with that, still is. The consultants may not have liked it, and that's a whole other thing I saw come into the business. When I started, Mega didn't exist, but it was pretty soon thereafter that marketing people started to realize, wow, we can do surveys, we can hold up pictures, we can do focus groups. And I mentioned in the book, there was a time in the business, in particularly the mid to late 90s, where male anchors simply started to disappear, and part of it was anchors who maybe had a receding hairline or something got tired of, in effect, submitting their entire career to a focus group's reaction to things like that. And it became too important. Very famous line by a news director, I think he was in Texas, about hiring attractive women to be reporters. He said, I can teach journalism, but I can't teach pretty.
Well, that's a question that comes up even in the journalism department and the communications department at St. Rose. One of my colleagues says she was taught early, you have a great face for radio.
Right. That's, yes.
And she tells the students that. But even our students, too, still think about, do I want to be on air? And initially they come in and they think they want to be an on-air personality, like an Ed Dague. But you talk about in the book how it's not everything it's cracked up to be.
No.
I mean, you talk about going out in Albany, and we know our small Albany market here. The market is each person knows the other, and it seems, especially if Ed Dague's delivering the nightly news, we know Ed Dague in the grocery store. So here people are going to see you and they're going to remember Ed was on TV and I used to always watch the news. How did you navigate the constant attention by people who live near you, who knew you?
Well, friends are one thing, although everyone has the same sort of thing. There's a very famous story about that when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, one of his best friends was the managing editor of the Washington Post. And she was a friend of Jacqueline Kennedy as well. And I'm failing to come up with his name, but he was the principal in Watergate. But he was very disturbed after the Kennedy assassination when they were discussing funeral arrangements, and Jackie stopped and said to him, "This, of course, is not for publication." And that wounded him. Because everyone is constantly aware that anything they may say to you possibly could wind up on TV or in the newspaper, and that's a difficulty. It's a wall between everyone all the time, and in that case, he was stunned that it was a wall between he and one of his closest friends in the world at a time of great tragedy, and still that wall was recognized. This is not for the paper. I had that too. A lot of friends all the time. I'm going to tell you something, but it's off the record. On the other hand, there was a woman you may have once worked for who was editor of the Troy Record, who on a symposium I was involved in one day, noted that her kids understood they could not tell her anything that had happened in school or in their life because it might wind up in the newspaper. That's extreme. How you draw that line, I don't know. But there's some people like Erastus Corning. Well, let me go back further, though. I also note in the book that with politicians especially, there's an understanding of off the record, on the record. But in television somehow, they seem to assume if it's not on camera, it's off the record, and that's absolutely not true. So I tell a story in the book of an area congressman who told me something very relevant. It was John Sweeney, when in his second term, when he was reelected and the Republicans scored big and there was now a much larger majority, they no longer needed the moderates from the Northeast to carry their basic votes in Congress. So John felt his position had diminished some. That's something that area viewers certainly should know. His constituents should know that. But when I asked him about it on air, right after he had told me about it, not off the record, but not on camera in studio, he dismissed it as, oh, something people always say. It's never true, never has been, never will be. And it was a lie. But you find you can't say, but wait a minute, you just told me, because you'd be saying that so often that it would actually start to affect your credibility, I felt. So you can't call them on it.
And that distinction that you're talking about, where some people, especially politicians who are so savvy with the media, they don't recognize, okay, this is a newspaper reporter, this is a television reporter, and what's the difference, and what's the difference between on and off the record. But to confide in a reporter that way and not understand the journalism is an interesting conundrum.
And not only that, sitting in the studio where he's about to give an interview, to confide that sort of thing. Now, part of the problem was, and here we go again with friendships, I had known John Sweeney for a very long time, since he was a really young politician in Troy, and I think he felt a friendship there that would prevent me from doing that sort of thing. But no, you're a member of Congress. Your sway in Congress has just diminished. You just told me about it. That's really news. There's just no way around it.
Did you always feel that loyalty to the viewers and the citizens that you're talking about when I need to tell this truth?
I got into journalism and to television journalism in particular, because I thought it was the most powerful part of journalism, and I wanted to make a difference. So I got in for really ideological reasons, and yes, I always felt that way. I also felt, even though I was very political all the time growing up, very, very staunchly anti-Vietnam War, I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't let that show because of my own idealism. I understood the concept of objectivity, that people expected it and that it had to be. So I worked very hard to, one, understand what I think, and two, keep it out. And you first have to understand what you think in order to be able to keep it out of your writing or your ad-libbing.
Right, and the critical reflection you are talking about, I think in watching news now and in reading the news, I feel sometimes it's not the way it was, or there's a reason there's less credibility, and the public has more suspect or is more suspicious of broadcasters and reporters on the newspaper. But you managed to keep that credibility the whole time.
Well, a lot of people get into television because they want to be stars, I think, and because it certainly in the older days, and it seemed to be. It seemed to look like it was just a great job and fun and show business and all that. That was never my motivation, so I kind of never fell into that. I also felt I wasn't particularly good looking. In fact, when I quit Channel 6, the general manager I quit later, like 6 months later, said on their air, "Look at what 13 has now. That's a face only a mother could love." Oh, no. And I winced, but kind of understood it. I didn't get into TV wanting to be a star. I got into TV wanting to better inform the public, believing that if they knew more, they would come to their sensibilities about the wrong things America was doing.
And you also talk about that in here, that
Yes.
you felt an obligation to people and that you wanted to make sure that you were getting stories out. And you also talk about, and you've done this in classrooms before too, that people should look at the news to get a perspective, but they shouldn't just look at the news.
Oh my, yes. I got in trouble with some news directors at the time when they understood what I was saying to the public in speeches. And I also got some favorable response from newspaper people. One guy had told me he had worked for Junior Achievement or something, and at the end he said, "In comes this TV star to grab all the credit," and he said, "I couldn't believe your message," which was, if you only watch television to get your news, please don't vote. You don't know enough. And I got into there about, in that meeting, about how politics influences business, that I don't think the railroads in America were defeated fairly and economically. They lost their position of preeminence in transportation largely because of Eisenhower and the political decision to build a highway system that made truckers become the preeminent system of transport. That is a case where politics and not business really influenced an entire industry. So politics is extremely important to all businessmen, and that was part of my message. Along with, don't just watch television, you have to read. And not just newspapers. At the time, I also said news magazines because they gave you a kind of wider perspective. Newspapers are very narrow, and you can get lost in the minutia of day to day, whereas Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report backed off some, and that was also useful. They largely don't exist anymore. Newsweek is a joke.
Yeah, the global perspective that you're talking about, though.
Yes.
It's hard to find it more.
Very hard to find it on the internet now. The internet scares me in the sense that you don't know what's edited for facts even. You can't really be sure of what you're reading unless you're on the website of an established journalistic organization. If you're on the Times website, you can be sure the stuff has been edited and fact-checked and that it's going to be as accurate as the journalist can make it at that time, which is a long way from saying it's absolutely accurate.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Oh, that raises some interesting questions about During your career on air, do you remember any of the mistakes or faux pas or things you thought, I wish I could take that back?
One in particular really bothered me, and it was after the retaking of the Attica prison following the uprising, where I reported as fact the state police allegation that everyone who died in there of bullet wounds was killed by the inmates. In fact, we now know that was not true. They were almost all killed by police fire. And it bothered me significantly that I wasn't skeptical at the time and simply reported that as fact. And I remember it to this day as one case where I accepted something, reported it as fact, when I really shouldn't have. And I'm still bothered by that. Yeah, there are things like that all the time, but that's journalism.
Right, that's reporting.
Exactly.
And that's the things we're trying to teach the students. I mean, through your stories in here and in the classrooms, that you need to go beyond. And a lot of, you don't know, even in today in class, you don't always know who's telling you the truth. So what is your obligation as a news gatherer? You know, what do you think about the people coming up in the field today? What would you suggest to them with this onslaught of technology, the constant battering of a 24/7 news cycle? How would you suggest they focus their goals and what they want to do with the news?
Well, there's all kinds of different types of journalism, so it depends on which part you're in. If you're a generalist, which I was, and which you were, by and large, my advice is simply read everything you can. Be interested in everything you can. But if you're a business reporter, then, you know, it's much more narrow, and you have to really read within that field. And again, within that field, everything you can find, every opinion you can find, every contrary opinion you can find, just kind of suck up like a sponge all the opinions and facts you can, and you'd be amazed how they fit together rather remarkably and suddenly to your own surprise when you're writing a story. It just happens.
And in a completely other direction, but it's very important that we talk about this, I think, because you wrote about it. Your family and how you came into the news. I mean, your decision to go into television news was unexpected. You were to be a mechanical engineer and attend Rensselaer Polytechnic. I'm sorry, electrical engineer and attend Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And your father had a particular feeling about that, but you completely went in another direction and had some resistance. Can you talk about why you decided to include it and more about what happened there?
Well, in growing up, I was told the whole time, you will be an engineer. Actually, initially, my father said, I will only send you to college for one of three things: engineering, medicine, or law. But he later changed that, and it became, you will go and study engineering. And it's kind of funny, he had never heard of RPI, and when I was a senior in high school, he had this good friend of his over to talk me out of this. And I still remember the scene because the guy was sitting in our living room having a drink with my father, and my father was talking and turned to me as this guy was sipping, and he said, what's the name of that podunk school you want to go to? And I said, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and the guy went, Jim, I can't even hire people who flunk out of there. Are you kidding me? My father was a graduate of Ohio State and had never heard of RPI. So then he became somewhat enthused about RPI, and when I got there and realized I had never really thought about what I wanted to do, and I hadn't, and I sort of knew that as a senior in high school. I really was wary of that. I knew I had not investigated enough colleges. I had not investigated what I really wanted to do. He became angrier and angrier as I became more and more certain I didn't want engineering, until finally when I told him, I will finish this, but I won't work in it. I think I want to work in broadcasting. He terminated tuition. I will no longer pay for your education, so I didn't finish. I had one term left. Then I left and went to work in radio, because RPI had allowed me to get the FCC license to run transmitters. After junior year at RPI, it was a pretty easy test. So radio stations were interested in hiring people who also had the license, because you could do two jobs, not one. And that's how I got into radio.
But doing two jobs was something you've done for most of your career, because you talk about in the book how you were producing the news and then you were the anchor.
Yeah.
How does one handle that?
Oh, that was that was about 3 years, maybe a little more. It was exciting. It really was fascinating to do every night. And in one sense, I loved it. And in the other, it was just too much work. It just became an impossible load. I don't know. When I first went, I have the face for radio, so I went to WGY, and I was there less than a year, actually, working next to the television assignment editor, 6 o'clock producer. I was working radio, and the two desks used to be side by side. Well, the TV assignment editor had a falling out with the news director, who one day said, You're now the 6 o'clock producer editor. And I had never done television. I really had never written for a living. I don't know how I did it. I took rundowns and saw what they were, and for the first couple of months was probably inept. I mean, I didn't have a whole lot of idea of what I was doing, but after a while, like everything else, it became much easier to do. I could kind of do it in my sleep. It was still pressure-packed, but it was more interesting than just anchoring. Anchoring can be just reading what someone else has written, which is challenging, but isn't sufficiently interesting. I always like to write. And even all the time at 13, it was terrific. As the technology changed, I could sit in my office, call up the 6 o'clock script, amend anything I wanted, just file it, and away it would go. That technology allowed me to not write everything I was going to read on air, but at least amend it, edit it, be familiar with it, and go with it. So technology was a great help. I was back with the typewriter when we started, and carbon sets.
There were typewriters in the Times-Union when I got there, and at the Troy Records.
We had a sports guy, Bob McNamara, who would not use electric typewriters. He had an old Underwood. He pounded on the keys, and we all wondered what happens when computers come in. Mac adjusted instantly to computers and turned to me 6 months later on set and said, Ed, I would never again work without him. And I was amazed. Here was a guy who couldn't adapt to electric typewriters, but loved computers. They made such a difference.
Yeah, the technology has accentuated the news, I think. I feel like things have improved as a result, even though there are drawbacks from the internet. If people are doing their jobs, it seems to facilitate the enterprise.
It made television... and I take credit, and it was really me and Steve Bobolis for Live Local Late Breaking. But frankly, Live Local Late Breaking really summed up what I thought television should and could do best. And that instantaneousness of television became more and more available and really allowed us to blossom as a news medium.
And Ed Dague, thank you so much. This has been so great. We love this visit today at Today's Author. This is Ed Dague and Kaylin Brown. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.